We've been talking a lot about subgraphs recently, and with good reason. In our 4.0 release of CloverETL, subgraphs can totally revamp the way that you work with data. But how exactly? If you look at this graph here, it looks pretty simple at first glance, appearing to contain only 9 components. But in here, and some of what look like normal components are in fact subgraphs, a new feature in 4.0. What's a subgraph though? A subgraph is a component that is implemented using another graph that comes with its own data inputs, outputs, and also potentially some configuration using parameters and metadata that you, as an author, can choose to expose to other users. For them, a subgraph looks just like any other component, but if you want, you can go inside of it, play around with it, embed and store metadata within it, or set different kinds of custom parameters in it as well. And, no matter how complex it becomes, it will still always be represented as a single, reusable brick of data logic. Just like with driving a car, the driver only needs to see the steering wheel and the pedals. He doesn't need to have deep knowledge about the car's inner workings to drive. And it's the same way with subgraphs. The more complicated bits are hidden from view, with only the important controls exposed. In this example here, we've got a graph that performs sentiment analysis on Twitter. Using subgraphs, it reads tweets from Twitter, and then analyzes whether they contain positive, negative, or neutral sentiment. Sentiment analysis on social media is a pretty hot topic these days, and you can process data around it quite easily with CloverETL. This graph contains several subgraphs inside of it, which means that despite how it appears, this graph doesn't contain only 9 components, but actually almost 30 components in total. The first thing we'll look at with subgraphs is how parameters and metadata work within them. In this first subgraph, read tweets cascade, you can see here there's a simple parameter in the properties named Twitter query. This one is exposed to you as a normal user from within the subgraph and lets you easily modify it. What the subgraph does is it will send out a query for that word or hashtag to Twitter, pull all related tweets, and then output them into CSV files. By creating subgraphs with parameters, you're doing something quite clever here. You can extract the business logic setup and expose it to users in a very easy to understand manner. Without this, a user would have to go all the way down here to this HTTP connector and manually enter the keyword into the CTL code, something that's quite hard to document and doesn't look too good. And if I want to reuse this subgraph for another data process involving Twitter, I can just take it and drop it into another graph, like so. And as you can see, all of your Twitter data are there, ready to use. So how to make a subgraph? There are 2 ways. The first is pretty simple. You can select the components in a pre-existing graph, like this one. Then you right-click the wrapping wizard, and here you'll see what your subgraph will look like, and then what the old graph will look like with your subgraph included. You press OK, and now you can see your new subgraph, already ready for your use. Now let's take a look at how you would build the subgraph from scratch. To create a subgraph from scratch, all you simply do is go to your subgraphs folder in the navigator here, and click to create new subgraph. And you can build a subgraph in any way that you want, setting it up as a data source, data target, or transformer, depending on how you use the input and output sections of the subgraph. So let's say you need a way to extract XML data with particular metadata as a customized data source, where the end user can easily specify the file URL for the data using a simple parameter. What you would do is set up a subgraph like here, with an XML extract reader. You'd put your metadata in, and you'd almost be there. The next step would be to go into your subgraph settings and export the file URL as a parameter. We talked a little about parameters earlier. For a subgraph, I would simply click onto the component here, select the property, and then click this little button at the top here to export it as a subgraph parameter. After that, I can then define its name, description, and optionally a default value. I also recommend setting a value hint. This gives users of your subgraphs a sample value or accepted format, for example, if the parameter requires a date. I can also encrypt it for passwords, or I could set it as a required element that's necessary for the graph to successfully run. These are only several of the many uses and abilities of subgraphs. Play around with them for yourself and see how they can simplify and help with your data integration workflow. In our next video, we'll get into more detail about how the metadata propagation feature can change the way you work with your data.